Welcome. In this video we're going to take another look at ProRAW running on the iOS 14.3 beta. Specifically we're going to look at how ProRAW differs from RAW that we can already shoot on iPhones today. Let's see how they compare. This is part 4 on my series on ProRAW. If you haven't seen the other videos, I'll link them here so you can check them out. Here we have a simple scene with the minion in the center, who's covered in a little bit of shade, with 8-bit Mario to the right, and a color checker on the left. We're going to use the Lightroom app to take the RAW photos, and the default camera app, obviously, to take the ProRAW photos. One of the main benefits of shooting RAW or ProRAW is to be able to change the brightness of the image after the fact. And to really push this to the test, I intentionally shot this scene 2 stops too bright and 2 stops too dark. And practically that means that I shot the scene 4 times too bright and 4 times too dark. So let's see how they do. So here's our first image. This is a RAW file taken with the Lightroom app. And we can obviously see that this one was overexposed. It's too bright. So if we come into Lightroom here, we can start off by bringing the exposure down by about 2 stops. And that starts looking quite a bit better. But we can see that our highlights are still too bright. So we can bring those down as well. And now it's starting to look a little bit better. We can see that the minion is still a little too dark, so I'll bring up the shadows a bit. And I'm noticing that the blacks are still getting cut off on the left on the histogram. So I'm going to bring up the black point a little bit to get that from clipping. And there we go. So we were able to rescue this image using a standard RAW file. And if we zoom in on the minion here, you can see that, yeah, it looks pretty good. There's a little bit of noise, but not bad at all. Now let's take a look at the same situation with ProRAW. As we can see here, again, this is way too bright. And we can start off by bringing down the exposure like before by about 2 stops. And we can bring down the highlights a little bit as well. We'll notice that the minion is also dark, so we'll bring up the shadows. And I'll bring up the black point just a little bit as well. And there we go. This image is also fixed. Now if we zoom into the minion here, you'll notice that there's not much noise at all. It looks like there's some sort of noise reduction built into ProRAW. And the overall level of detail is pretty impressive. We can see some of the fine stitch marks on his clothes. So far we've seen that both with RAW and with ProRAW we can rescue images that are too bright. But what if images are too dark? Let's try that out. Here's the same scene again, except now it's 2 stops too dark. And we can start off by bringing up the exposure by 2 stops. And again we can bring down the highlights. And we'll raise the shadows a little bit. Now if we zoom in, we'll notice that the image looks pretty similar and it's pretty clear, but we're noticing that noise in the image that we saw last time as well. So let's see how the ProRAW image looks. We can make the same changes here. We can bring up the exposure by 2. We can also increase the shadows to bring out the minion, and we'll change the blacks again to have them not get clipped. And there we go. It looks like we shot this image perfectly, even though we didn't. And if we zoom in, we'll notice that the minion still has the same level of detail that he had in the previous example. So what have we learned here? The main takeaway for me is that ProRAW isn't drastically different from RAW that we can already shoot with these phones. Even with the regular RAW files, we can recover images that are too dark or too bright. The main advantage of ProRAW is the extra detail we get from the computational photography. And it's a nice feature to have. But I can still see situations where people might prefer to shoot in the standard RAW files. I think some photographers will still prefer standard RAW in some situations, especially if they don't want that processed look like we saw with the noise reduction that's being applied. I hope you found it interesting. Make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.